Beneath the veil of Louisiana in the year 1844, where magnolia blooms clung to the air and lanterns glowed against the dusk, whispers took shape. They spoke of a widow whose beauty was both blessing and curse. Her name was Celeste. Draped in silks as dark as mourning veils, she carried herself with grace that stilled conversation and laughter that lingered like perfume. Men of wealth and power bent toward her, certain they had been chosen by Providence. Yet always, their names were carved into stone too soon. The town counted the graves, first one, then two, then three, and still Celeste's fortune and influence only grew. Neighbors lowered their eyes when her carriage passed, whispering prayers as though her gaze alone carried a curse. Some swore that beneath her crypt, the soil stirred at night, as though the dead had not truly surrendered to silence. On storm-soaked evenings, travelers claimed to hear faint scratching carried on the wind, echoing from where no living hand should reach. Still, new suitors came, blinded by beauty, deaf to warning. For Celeste did not simply bury husbands, she bound them. And in her world, vows were not broken. They were preserved in darkness, eternal and unyielding. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. A grand plantation in 1844 Louisiana sat beneath sprawling moss-draped oaks. The air was thick with humidity, heavy with the scent of river water and sweet magnolia. Cypress Grove rose in solemn pride, its white columns shining in the sun, its iron gates closed against the curious eyes of the town. Behind those gates lived Celeste Beaumont, the widow who never escaped the whispers that followed her. She was striking in her beauty, tall and graceful, her figure always draped in layers of black silk that rustled like sighs as she passed. Her face was pale and unreadable, her lips rarely curved into a smile. When she walked into church on Sunday mornings, the pews shifted with unease. Her veil cast shadows across her eyes, and though her gaze never lingered on anyone for long, the congregation felt watched. Rumors clung to her like perfume, faint yet inescapable. The stories spread through town in hushed tones. They said her first husband, Charles Beaumont, a cotton baron of great wealth, had vanished on a storming night, leaving his bed cold and his boots gone. They said her second, a French wine merchant, disappeared after a feast, his laughter echoing for the last time beneath the magnolia trees. Her third, a judge, proud and stern, was last seen arguing with her before slipping into silence. 3 husbands gone, 3 funerals with coffins lowered quickly into the ground, each one sealed without a body. No one spoke of it openly, but the people wondered. Was she cursed, destined to walk alone and leave graves behind her? Or was there something more sinister, a secret buried beneath the soil of Cypress Grove? The parish priest looked at her with wary eyes, yet even he dared not accuse her. Her donations kept the church candles burning, her gifts of silver and lace filled the altar, and her soft words made the boldest men falter. At dusk, the slaves on the plantation whispered of her shadow gliding along the veranda, of her footsteps echoing near the crypt when the moon was high. They claimed to hear her humming, a low melody that carried through the night air like a lullaby for the dead. Sometimes the earth beneath the magnolia trees looked freshly turned, and sometimes faint knocks sounded where no hand should be. But when questioned, Celeste only lowered her gaze and let silence answer for her. She was admired as much as she was feared. Gentlemen still sought her company, drawn to her beauty, blinded by her sorrowful charm. Women envied her elegance, though they crossed themselves when she walked by. She lived between adoration and dread, neither saint nor sinner in the public eye, but something far more elusive. The town of Cypress Grove thrived on whispers, yet none dared confront her. The widow's fortune grew with each husband's disappearance, and her influence spread like the roots of the oaks that shaded her land. Still, behind her veils and her graceful steps, behind her black silks and her pale composure, there lingered the unspoken truth. Celeste Beaumont was not simply a woman of tragedy. She was a woman of secrets. And in the quiet of Louisiana's heavy nights, those secrets waited, buried in the shadows of Cypress Grove. Celeste Beaumont's first wedding was the talk of Louisiana. The year was 1828, and Cypress Grove glistened with lantern light. The oaks were strung with ribbons, the veranda lined with musicians who played waltzes deep into the evening. Guests arrived in carriages from New Orleans and beyond, their gowns rustling, their boots polished, their voices rising in laughter. The air was thick with perfume, tobacco, and the heavy sweetness of magnolia blossoms. Charles Beaumont, a cotton baron of immense wealth, stood proudly at her side. He was older than Celeste, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, a man who commanded respect in every room he entered. To him, Celeste was a prize, a jewel to be displayed, a beauty that brought envy to other men and admiration to other women. To the guests, the pair seemed a match of fortune and elegance, strength and grace woven into one. Celeste smiled through the night, her lips soft, her eyes lowered with perfect modesty. Yet those who studied her closely might have seen something else flicker beneath her composure. A calculation, a depth beyond the tender blush of a bride. She moved with a calm assurance, as though every detail of the evening had unfolded according to her secret design. The feast stretched long, with tables heavy with roasted meats, sugared fruits, and crystal decanters of wine. Guests toasted the couple, praising the union, raising their glasses to love and prosperity. Charles beamed, his pride unshaken, his laughter filling the great hall. Celeste lifted her glass too, her voice soft as she echoed the toasts, yet her eyes seemed distant, their light caught by some hidden thought. As the night wore on, clouds gathered over Cypress Grove. The music faltered when thunder cracked across the sky. Rain began to fall in sheets, drumming against the windows, flooding the garden paths. Within the house, candles flickered, shadows danced across the walls, and the guests whispered of omens. Celeste stood at the window, her veil drawn back, her gaze fixed on the storm as though it were a familiar companion. By dawn, the celebration had ended. Guests departed under gray skies, leaving the plantation silent once more. But Charles Beaumont was nowhere to be found. His bed was cold, his boots gone, the door still locked from the inside. Servants searched the grounds, their lanterns swinging across wet earth and dripping leaves. No trace of him was found. Celeste wept when the news spread, her face pale against her black veil. Her voice trembled with sorrow. Yet her tears dried too quickly, her grief fading into quiet acceptance. The townsfolk gathered, speaking in hushed tones of curses, of storms, of shadows. A coffin was built, but no body lay within. The funeral passed swiftly, the widow draped in mourning silk, her gaze steady as the earth closed over the empty grave. Thus began the story of Celeste Beaumont, the bride whose vows outlived her husband, the widow who would carry whispers with her forevermore. The morning after the storm broke heavy and gray over Cypress Grove. The oaks dripped with rain, their branches sagging under the weight of water. Inside the grand house, silence hung like a veil, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the distant calls of crows. Servants moved cautiously, whispering among themselves, for something was amiss. Charles Beaumont's bed was cold. The sheets, untouched, bore no trace of his restless sleep. His boots were missing, though the polished floor showed no footprints. More troubling still, the doors of his chamber had been locked from the inside. No one had entered, and no one had left. The mystery clung to the air like the fading scent of tobacco smoke. Celeste appeared in the hallway, her silk nightdress trailing like shadows at her feet. Her voice trembled as she called for her husband, her tone steeped in sorrow. Servants searched every corridor, every corner of the house, every path in the gardens. But Charles was nowhere to be found. The storm had washed away any sign of him, leaving only wet soil and broken branches. Neighbors arrived as the news spread. They found Celeste pale and grief-stricken, her delicate hands pressed to her lips, her eyes shimmering with tears. She clung to the priest as he entered, her sobs rising like a hymn of despair. Yet, as the hours passed, those tears dried too quickly. Her face became still, her gaze calm, her mourning quiet and composed. It was as though she had already prepared herself for this fate. The townsfolk gathered in hushed clusters, their whispers weaving into the wind. Some claimed Charles had fled, abandoning his bride on their first night. Others insisted the storm had swallowed him, carried him into the river's depths. But darker voices hinted at something closer to home, something hidden in the shadows of Cypress Grove. A grave was dug on the hill behind the church, the earth damp and black from the rain. The coffin was built with haste, though no body lay within. The funeral came quickly, a ceremony of mourning draped in silence. Celeste stood at the center, veiled in black silk, her pale face serene as the coffin was lowered into the ground. No cries escaped her lips, no trembling of hands betrayed her sorrow. She bowed her head, as if to close the chapter, as if to bury not only her husband, but the questions that lingered around her. The townsfolk returned to their homes unsettled. A bed left cold, boots gone, doors locked from within. A grave without a body, and a widow whose grief seemed more rehearsed than real. In the hearts of those who watched, unease took root. The story of Celeste Beaumont was only beginning, and already it carried the weight of secrets. The disappearance of Charles Beaumont remained unsolved, yet time moved forward as though the earth itself conspired to bury the mystery. Months turned into years, and the widow of Cypress Grove continued her life in quiet grace. She wore her mourning silks with dignity, her face serene, her steps measured. To the townsfolk, she seemed a figure touched by sorrow, fragile and untouchable, a woman destined to drift alone beneath the weight of her tragedy. It was during this time that a new presence entered her world. His name was Lucien Dufresne, a French wine merchant whose caravans brought bottles of deep red and golden white to Louisiana's grandest tables. He was younger than Charles, handsome in a polished way, his hair dark and carefully kept, his accent carrying the charm of faraway places. When Lucien first laid eyes upon Celeste, he was struck silent, as though her beauty had drained the words from his tongue. To him she was not a widow shrouded in suspicion, but a woman of rare grace. He saw her loneliness and mistook it for vulnerability. He heard the soft tremor in her voice and thought it a plea for comfort. In Celeste, he believed he had found both tragedy and poetry, a soul in need of protection and devotion. Celeste received his attention with a quiet smile. She allowed his visits, his gifts of French wine, his verses whispered in broken English. She walked with him through the gardens, her veil trailing in the wind, her laughter faint yet haunting. To the townsfolk, it seemed as though the widow's heart had stirred once more, that perhaps she might reclaim the joys she had lost. Yet there was something in her gestures, in the way her hand lingered on his arm, in the way her gaze fixed upon him with a depth that unsettled. She spoke often of eternity, not as an abstract dream but as something tangible, something she could hold in her hands. Her words flowed like silk, speaking of vows that never broke, of promises bound beyond the grave. Lucien listened, captivated, never questioning the shadows woven between her sentences. More curious still were her walks with him to the family crypt. She led him there at dusk, when the sky burned with fading light and the air was thick with the scent of damp stone. Standing before the iron gate, she would place her hand upon it as if greeting an old companion. She spoke of love that endured, of bonds that death could not sever. Lucien, bewitched, believed her words to be those of a romantic soul. He never saw the chill in her smile, nor the strange flicker in her eyes as the crypt door creaked in the wind. The town whispered again, their voices weaving through taverns and markets. A second suitor for the widow of Cypress Grove. Would he share her fortune or her fate? None dared ask aloud, but in their hearts, unease grew once more. For Celeste, Beaumont was not a woman who loved lightly, nor one who let go of those who gave her their vows. The summer night was thick with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and refused to let go. Cypress Grove glowed with candlelight as Celeste Beaumont hosted a dinner that shimmered with elegance. Guests gathered at her long mahogany table, feasting on roasted quail, sweet yams, and wines brought from distant vineyards of France. At her side sat Lucien Dufresne, her second husband, smiling with the pride of a man who believed fortune had finally chosen him. The music of violins filled the hall, mingling with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Celeste's beauty shone brighter than the chandeliers, her pale face framed by curls of dark hair, her voice carrying soft notes of charm that wrapped themselves around every ear. Yet, beneath her serene poise, her eyes held a strange light, a flicker that unsettled those who dared to look too closely. The feast carried on until the candles burned low, the air heavy with smoke and wine, the storm of the season pressing against the windows. When the guests departed into the humid dark, Cypress Grove fell into silence. Lucien lingered with his bride in the parlor, his laughter still echoing from the night's indulgence. But by morning, his laughter was gone. His chamber stood empty, his belongings untouched, his boots left by the hearth. The doors were locked, the windows barred. Yet the man had vanished as though the night itself had swallowed him. Servants whispered in fear, their eyes darting toward the gardens where the magnolia trees spread their heavy branches. The earth beneath them looked freshly disturbed, the soil darker, unsettled, as if something had been placed beneath it in the stillness of night. No one spoke of it aloud, for the widow's presence was commanding, her gaze sharp as glass. She stood at the veranda, her veil drifting in the morning air, and declared with quiet certainty that Lucien had fled. His debts in France had caught up with him, she said, and shame had driven him to vanish. The story spread quickly, carried on the tongues of the town. Some pitied her, believing she had been abandoned a second time. Others whispered of curses, of shadows that clung to Cypress Grove, of a widow whose husbands never lingered. They lowered their voices when she passed, yet their eyes followed her every step. Her silks swayed through the church pews, her face a mask of grief, her composure unbroken even as the whispers grew louder. And beneath the magnolia trees the earth remained disturbed, the soil never settling, as though it carried a secret the town dared not uncover. The scent of blossoms hung heavy in the air, sweet and suffocating, a perfume that clung to every breath. In that place, beauty and dread intertwined, and the name of Celeste Beaumont became ever more tangled with mystery. By the time the judge came into her life, Celeste Beaumont was no longer merely a widow. She was a legend whispered about in the streets of Cypress Grove, a figure caught between beauty and fear. Men spoke of her with a mixture of awe and unease. Women watched her with suspicion, though some secretly envied her composure, her elegance, her command of every room she entered. 2 husbands gone, and yet she remained untouched by ruin, her fortunes intact, her poise sharper than ever. The judge was a man of stature, respected in court and feared by those who stood before him. He was accustomed to authority, his word carrying the weight of law. To him, Celeste was not a threat but a challenge. He saw in her the fragility of a woman struck by misfortune, and he believed himself strong enough, clever enough, to master what others could not. His pride swelled at the thought of becoming the man who would endure where the others had failed. Their courtship was swift. He showered her with gifts, with promises of stability and honor, and she received them with the faintest of smiles. In public she appeared grateful, even delicate, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her voice soft as though she leaned on his strength. But beneath those small gestures was something else, something the judge never noticed. Her eyes lingered on him not with devotion, but with a quiet, unreadable calculation. The wedding was smaller than her first, quieter than her second, but still marked by grandeur. Cypress Grove's church bells rang, and the people gathered outside to glimpse the widow's third union. Some whispered that she sought redemption, others murmured of curses, and a few wondered if the judge had sealed his own fate with his vows. Still, the bride was radiant in black lace trimmed with silver, and the groom stood tall with the certainty of a man convinced he had triumphed. Life within their marriage was not one of passion, but of dominance and control. The judge demanded obedience, his voice stern, his rules absolute. Yet Celeste never resisted. She moved through the days with calm compliance, her silks rustling through the halls, her face serene. To those who looked from outside, she seemed the perfect wife, silent and devoted. But silence has its own kind of power. She gave him no reason for suspicion, no crack in her demeanor to suggest rebellion. Still, a strange unease began to coil around him in the late hours, when the shadows of Cypress Grove grew long, and the crypt beneath the magnolias seemed to breathe with secrets. He believed he could tame her. He believed her beauty was a prize to command, her sorrow a weakness to mend, but the truth was far older and deeper than his pride could fathom. For Celeste Beaumont was not a woman to be mastered. She was the storm at the heart of the grove, a presence that consumed, patient, and inevitable. And though the judge did not yet know it, his fate had already been sealed the moment he took her hand. The nights in Cypress Grove were heavy with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and made the air feel thick. The cicadas droned, and the moss hanging from the oaks swayed in the faintest breeze. Yet among those sounds came another, softer and more haunting, a sound that made the field hands pause in their work and the servants whisper prayers under their breath. It was the sound of Celeste Beaumont humming. The widow's voice drifted across the plantation like smoke, curling through the darkness, carrying notes that were too gentle to be mourning and too strange to be comfort. The tune was a lullaby, sweet at its surface, yet threaded with something that unsettled the heart. Those who heard it felt an ache they could not explain, as though grief itself had learned to sing. Night after night the melody returned, rising from the direction of the family crypt, where the mausoleum stood in shadow beneath the magnolia trees. One stable boy swore he had seen her there with his own eyes. He told the others in whispers, speaking of a figure dressed in black silk gliding across the damp grass, her pale face lit faintly by moonlight. She walked slowly, as if unhurried, as if time itself waited for her. And when she stopped at the iron gate of the crypt, she rested her hand upon the bars, her lips moving with the song that carried through the night. He claimed he had seen more than her shadow. Behind the gate, something stirred. It was not the sway of branches or the flutter of bats, but a shape, indistinct, shifting as though struggling to rise. He had frozen where he stood, his breath caught in his throat, and he swore he heard the faint scrape of stone against stone, like a coffin lid shifting in its place. By the time he blinked, the figure was gone, and only Celeste remained, her song fading into silence. When the boy told his tale, the others mocked him at first, but their laughter was nervous and thin. Deep down, they knew that strange things had always lingered near the widow. Too many men had vanished from her side. Too many graves lay without bodies beneath them. And now, too often, her song filled the night when no comfort was needed. Some said she sang to the dead, coaxing them with her voice as a mother soothes a restless child. Others whispered that her husbands had never truly left, that they lingered beneath the earth, listening, waiting, bound by vows stronger than death itself. No one dared approach the mausoleum after dusk, for fear of hearing the tune too closely, for fear of seeing the shadows move where no living man should be. And still, night after night, the widow's song rose again, carrying its sweetness and sorrow, weaving dread into the hearts of all who listened. For Celeste Beaumont sang not for the living, but for those who could not leave her. And her voice was the only proof they had that something beneath the magnolias was still awake. The parish priest had buried many men in his time, but the funerals of Celeste Beaumont's husbands troubled him in ways he could not quiet. Each service had been marked by the same strangeness. The hurried preparations, the closed casket, the widow's insistence that no one look upon the body. In the first instance, grief explained much. In the second, whispers began. By the third, doubt festered like a wound that refused to heal. He remembered the first burial clearly. Charles Beaumont, the cotton baron, lowered into the earth without a final glance from friend or family. Celeste had spoken of his illness, her voice trembling, her veil heavy across her face. The casket was sealed before anyone asked a question, and the grave was filled quickly, as though the ground itself demanded haste. At the time, the priest had pitied her. He believed sorrow had made her fearful of last goodbyes. But then came the second. The French merchant, charming and vain, had vanished in the night. No body was found, only Celeste's account of his sudden flight from debts. Yet a coffin appeared in the church all the same, draped in lilies, lowered into the Beaumont crypt with solemn prayer. The priest remembered the unease in the congregation that day, the sidelong glances, the murmured doubts. But Celeste had stood calm, her hand resting on the polished wood, her face pale and perfect in its composure. The third husband's burial left the priest with a weight he could not cast aside. The judge, a man of influence, was said to have died suddenly, struck by fever. Again, there was no body shown, no proof given. The casket arrived sealed tight, the widow once more urging the service to proceed without delay. And once more he obeyed, though his heart recoiled at the strangeness of it. 3 husbands, 3 closed coffins, 3 hurried burials. It was not grief that silenced him. It was gold. Celeste Beaumont gave generously to the church, her hand always extended with gifts, her gaze steady as she pressed coin into his palm. The donations repaired the roof, restored the altar, fed the poor, and clothed the orphans. Each offering came at the right moment, as if she knew his conscience was beginning to stir. And with every gift his questions grew quieter, his doubts buried like the coffins themselves. Yet in the stillness of night, the priest wrestled with his guilt. He saw in his mind the mausoleum's iron gate, the shadows beneath the magnolia trees, the rush of earth piled high before its time. He wondered if the graves were filled with emptiness, if the coffins cradled not the dead, but air, silence, and secrets. The parish depended on him for guidance, but he carried within him a truth too terrible to speak. For what if the widow's husbands were not beneath the soil at all? What if her song at night was not for the dead, but for those she had hidden away, bound in darkness, unseen by every eye but her own? The judge was a man who trusted in order, in law, in the clarity of evidence. Yet in the halls of Cypress Grove, he began to hear things that defied reason. At first it was only faint, a sound like tapping, distant and irregular. He dismissed it as rodents in the walls, a nuisance that could be solved with traps and poison. But the noises did not stop. They grew more insistent, like knuckles rapping against wood, steady, deliberate, as though someone sought to be heard. Each night, as shadows stretched across the plantation, he lay awake in the great bed beside Celeste, listening. Her breathing was even, her body still, untouched by fear. The judge told himself it was imagination, that grief had unsettled his mind, yet unease settled in his bones. He felt it most in the stillness, when the candles burned low and the song of cicadas fell silent. In those moments, the tapping seemed closer, as if it came not from the walls but from beneath the floor. One evening, after a long day in court, the judge returned home to find Celeste waiting in the parlor. She wore a gown of black satin, her face pale and expressionless as ever. He spoke to her of the sounds, of his unease, and she listened in silence, her eyes unblinking, her lips curved into the faintest smile. He accused her of knowing something, of hiding something, his voice raised in anger he had not shown before. She did not argue. She only said that the house was old, and old houses carry voices of their own. That night, the judge paced the halls long after the servants had gone to bed. The tapping followed him, soft but steady, echoing in the boards beneath his feet. He carried a lantern, its light trembling against the walls, yet the glow revealed nothing but shadows. He descended into the cellar, convinced he would find vermin or loose stone, but the air was still, heavy, damp with earth. The sound seemed to vanish as he searched, only to return again the moment he stood still. Days later, his seat at court sat empty. The judge, once so proud and unyielding, was gone. No message was sent, no farewell given. His robes remained draped over the chair in his chambers, his quill still resting beside an unfinished judgment. In Cypress Grove, Celeste walked alone once more, her veil drawn, her steps measured. When asked, she said only that her husband had fallen ill and left to recover in solitude. Few believed her, yet no one dared to speak the truth aloud. The whispers spread through the parish. 3 husbands gone, 3 coffins sealed, and now a judge vanished as though swallowed by the very earth. Some said he had fled, overcome by madness. Others swore they still heard knocking in the walls of Cypress Grove, faint but steady, like a gavel striking wood from beneath the ground. The people of Cypress Grove had long practiced the art of silence, but even silence has its breaking point. By the time the judge vanished, the town could no longer ignore the truth pressing at their throats. 3 husbands gone, 3 coffins sealed without proof, and always the widow standing at the center, untouched, composed, her fortune swelling as though death itself had become her benefactor. In the marketplace, women gathered at the well and lowered their voices, their words carried only to the ears nearest them. They spoke of Celeste's beauty, sharp and ageless, of her black silks that rustled like whispers of morning even in the brightness of day. They counted the years between each marriage, the suddenness of each loss, the speed with which wealth flowed into her hands. And always their eyes darted to the church steps, where the widow sometimes lingered, her gaze calm, as though she knew they whispered but cared not at all. The men, too, spoke of her, but their voices carried envy and unease. Merchants muttered that her land stretched wider with every season, that debts once owed to her husbands now rested squarely in her control. Some admired her shrewdness, others cursed her power, yet none dared to challenge her. For those who did business with her found their accounts settled quickly, her coin pure, her promises kept. To them she was both danger and salvation, a woman no man could master and no man could afford to cross. At the parish the priest felt the weight of unspoken suspicion pressing down upon him. Parishioners looked to him for answers, their eyes questioning, their hearts uneasy. Yet he had no words to offer, only blessings spoken with a voice grown heavy with doubt. He knew the coffins had been sealed too quickly, knew her gold had stilled his questions, yet his tongue clung to silence as if it were prayer. Children, too, felt the shift, for even their games changed. They dared one another to run past the Beaumont crypt, to touch its iron gate, to press an ear against the stone and listen for voices. Some swore they heard faint knocks. Others swore they heard her song, the same soft melody their parents spoke of in fear. To them, the widow was no longer merely a figure in black, but a story alive, a shadow that belonged to every whispered tale. Still, Celeste walked the streets with poise, her chin high, her veil drawn, her presence commanding silence wherever she passed. If she heard the gossip, she gave no sign. If she felt the sting of suspicion, it never touched her face. And perhaps that was what unsettled them most of all. For while the town trembled with its own whispers, the widow of Cypress Grove remained untouched, untouchable, as though the secrets they feared were hers alone to keep. The undertaker of Cypress Grove was a man accustomed to silence. He had spent his life among coffins and graves, his hands steady, his face without expression, his craft practiced with precision. Yet when he spoke in hushed tones to the priest one evening, his voice shook with a memory that refused to fade. He told of the night he prepared the coffin of Celeste Beaumont's second husband. The French merchant, said to have fled debts, was buried swiftly in the Beaumont crypt. But before the lid was sealed, as the undertaker leaned close with his hammer and nails, he heard it. A sound faint but undeniable. The scrape of fingernails against wood. A whisper of life clawing from within. His hands had trembled, the hammer slipping from his grip. He froze, his breath shallow, his ears straining against the stillness of the room. Again it came, soft scratching, desperate, muffled by the coffin's pine walls. For the first time in his long years, he felt the weight of death blur with the pulse of the living. Before he could act, Celeste appeared at his side. She moved with the grace of a shadow, her eyes fixed on him, cold and unyielding. He tried to speak, to tell her of the sound, but her gaze silenced him. There was no fear in her, no surprise, only a calm command that bound his will. She placed her hand upon the lid, her touch soft yet final, and told him to continue. His heart thundered, but his hands obeyed. He lifted the hammer once more, nails biting into the wood, sealing whatever lay within. Each strike rang louder in his ears than any church bell, echoing through the hollows of his soul. By the time the last nail was driven, the scratching had ceased. Only silence remained. The undertaker carried that silence with him, heavy as the soil he shoveled each day. He confessed to no one, save the priest years later, when whispers in the parish grew louder and the widow's legend darkened with each vanished man. Even then, he could not bear to speak her name with accusation. He only admitted that he had heard life where there should have been none, and that fear and her steady gaze had forced him to betray the living to the grave. From that night on, he could not bring himself to linger near the Beaumont crypt. For whenever he passed its iron gate, he swore he still heard the faintest echo of nails against wood, a sound that lived in his memory and followed him like a shadow. And in his heart, he knew the truth he could never speak aloud: that the coffins of Celeste Beaumont were not filled with death alone. They were filled with silence born of fear, a silence he had nailed shut with his own trembling hands. Celeste Beaumont had grown accustomed to the gaze of men. Some looked with admiration, others with envy, and more than a few with fear. By now, she had become a figure wrapped in whispers, a woman cloaked in both beauty and dread. Yet when the young heir to a neighboring plantation first laid eyes upon her, he saw none of it. To him, she was a vision of elegance, untouched by sorrow, untouched by rumor. He was barely 20, still more boy than man. Wealth surrounded him, yet he bore the restless hunger of one eager to prove his place in the world. His inheritance weighed on him, a burden he mistook for purpose. And when Celeste's smile fell upon him, he believed it was fate. She welcomed his company with gentle laughter and eyes that seemed to hold secrets meant only for him. He mistook her practiced glances for affection, her soft words for trust. Around her he felt taller, braver, as though her very presence polished his youth into something resembling power. The townsfolk watched from a distance. They knew the signs, the same steps that had led 3 husbands into shadow. Yet the boy ignored their warnings, blind to the chill that followed Celeste wherever she went. His friends spoke of her past, of the graves and the vanished men, but he laughed it away. He told himself they were jealous, too blind to see the woman she truly was. Celeste played her part with grace. She leaned close when he spoke, listening as though his words carried the weight of wisdom. She allowed him to dream aloud of futures, of children, of land expanded and fortune doubled. Never once did she correct him. Instead, she encouraged him, her hand brushing his arm, her voice promising loyalty, her smile promising eternity. At night, when the magnolia blossoms perfumed the air, she led him along the shaded paths of her estate. She guided him near the crypt, though he noticed nothing unusual in her steps. To him, the mausoleum was a monument to legacy. To her, it was a vault of secrets. The boy spoke of devotion, of his willingness to give her everything he owned, everything he was. His heart raced, and she listened with patience, her face radiant in the moonlight. Inside, she already knew how the tale would end. She had written it before, and she would write it again. The trap was already woven, thread by thread, hidden behind tenderness and grace. To him, she was salvation. To her, he was only the next chapter in a story that had been written long ago, a story whispered in crypts and carried by the wind. And as his eager footsteps followed her deeper into her world, the shadows stretched longer, as though the earth itself knew what awaited him. Celeste Beaumont knew the art of enchantment better than any woman in Louisiana. Her dinners were the pinnacle of society, evenings that glittered with refinement and indulgence. Candles glowed across long polished tables, their flames dancing against silverware and crystal goblets. The air filled with aromas of Creole delicacies, rich gumbo simmering with spice, oysters seasoned with herbs, and pralines melting like sugar on the tongue. Guests left her home carrying the memory of warmth, of laughter, of a night that seemed touched by magic. The young heir was captivated. Every glance she offered him seemed dipped in affection, every laugh a secret meant only for his ears. When she raised her glass, her eyes lingered on him a heartbeat longer than the others. He swelled with pride, convinced her heart leaned toward him as surely as the magnolias leaned toward the Sunday. Yet beneath the shimmer of candlelight, questions brewed. For nights after their gatherings, He noticed her disappear into the darkness, slipping away once her guests had gone. More than once, he spied her figure drifting across the lawn toward the family crypt, her black silks brushing the grass, her pale face silvered by moonlight. At first he told himself it was grief. A widow, after all, must mourn, and perhaps she found comfort speaking to the stones that bore the names of her husbands. But the longer he watched, the less her visits resembled mourning. She lingered too long. Sometimes, he thought he heard her humming that strange, lilting tune, soft and haunting in the still air. Other times, he swore he saw her kneel, pressing her ear to the iron bars of the mausoleum gate, listening as though something inside might speak back. Curiosity began to pull at him. Caution whispered that he should turn away, but his heart, young and restless, urged him onward. He imagined her secret grief, her fragile heart, and felt certain she longed for someone to share the burden with. He believed he could be that man. One midnight, unable to contain himself, he followed. The grass was wet with dew, and the cicadas sang their endless chorus. He kept to the shadows, watching her slender form glide toward the crypt. She paused before the gate, her hand resting on the cold iron. The young heir's breath quickened. She seemed to whisper into the night, her voice low, tender, almost coaxing. The boy's chest tightened with a mixture of awe and unease. What secrets did she share with the tombs? Why did she seem less like a grieving widow and more like a queen visiting her subjects? He should have turned back, but the spell of her charm was too strong. Curiosity overcame caution, and with each step closer to her world, he drifted deeper into the snare she had so carefully laid. The young heir could not quiet the storm inside his chest. For nights he had watched her disappear into the shadows, her figure gliding toward the crypt with steps too deliberate to be mere mourning. That evening, the weight of curiosity pressed harder than fear, and he carried a small candle to guide his way. The flame flickered against the dark, trembling like his own resolve. He kept his distance at first, careful not to betray his presence. The air was heavy with the scent of magnolia blossoms and damp earth. From across the lawn, he saw her reach the crypt, her hand sliding over the iron gate as though caressing the skin of a lover. Then, without hesitation, she slipped inside, vanishing into the stone mouth of the mausoleum. His heart thundered. He hesitated at the threshold, every part of him screaming to turn back, yet his hand pushed forward against the cold iron. The gate gave way with a low groan. The candle's glow spilled into the crypt, casting long shadows across the damp walls. The air inside was colder than the night. It clung to his lungs, damp and suffocating, carrying the scent of mildew and stone. He raised the candle higher, its flame shaking as he stepped deeper. His eyes strained against the gloom, searching for her form among the tombs. Then he froze. From the silence came a sound that should not have been. A muffled groan, low and hollow, as though pressed through layers of earth and wood. His breath caught in his throat. Again, it came, the desperate thud of something alive, trapped within the confines of death. The boy's candle shook violently, spilling wax across his hand, yet he dared not drop it. He strained his ears, listening, praying he had imagined it. But the sound grew clearer, a scratching against wood, a faint cry pressed into silence. His blood ran cold. The coffins. They were not resting places but prisons. The realization clawed at his mind, unraveling the illusion he had so eagerly embraced. The dead were not dead. He turned, desperate to find her, and there she was. Celeste stood at the far end of the crypt, her black silks blending with the shadows. Her eyes glowed in the faint light, not with sorrow, but with triumph. She had been watching him all along. The boy stammered, his voice breaking in terror, but no words formed. She raised a finger to her lips, silencing him with a gesture both tender and cruel. Then she turned her gaze to the coffins. Another groan rose, followed by frantic scratching, the sounds of men who had not yet surrendered to the grave. The heir's knees weakened. He realized with horror that her husbands had not vanished. They had been buried alive, sealed away beneath stone and earth, their muffled cries hidden by the widow's wealth and charm. His candlelight flickered wildly, shadows dancing across the walls like restless spirits. And in that terrible glow, Celeste Beaumont stepped closer, her smile calm, her beauty undiminished, her secret fully revealed. The crypt's breath was no longer silent. It pulsed with life, with despair, with the endless whispers of men who had thought themselves her masters, only to find themselves her captives. The young heir knew then that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Beneath the crypt, past the stone steps worn smooth with time, lay chambers no map recorded and no priest had ever blessed. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the smell of damp brick and the sour tang of decay. The young heir's candle shivered as though it too feared what awaited below. What he found was not death, but its cruel imitation. Behind walls of brick and mortar, narrow as coffins yet taller than a man, came the sounds no living soul should ever hear in such a place. Scratching, faint and frantic. Nails dragging across stone. Voices, hoarse and broken, calling out for water, for mercy, for release. He pressed closer, his heart thundering. A trembling hand brushed the surface of one wall, and from within came a weak thud, as though the inhabitant sensed his presence. The heir stumbled back, his breath ragged. He wanted to flee, yet his eyes could not turn away. There were several chambers, each sealed tight. Within them, shadows moved. A hand, pale and skeletal, slipped through a crack, only to retreat again. A voice rose, raspy and desperate, calling a name he almost recognized. Charles. The first husband. Then another voice, thicker with an accent, gasped in French pleas. The wine merchant. And deeper still, a stern tone cracked into sobs, the voice of the judge. The heir's mind reeled. He had heard the stories, the whispers of disappearances, but he had believed them exaggerations. Now the truth clawed at his ears, undeniable and merciless. They were alive. Not buried beneath soil but bricked into tombs of stone, forced to linger in suffering too cruel to name. Celeste appeared beside him then, silent as shadow. He flinched, nearly dropping the candle, but her hand steadied his with eerie calm. Her eyes gleamed, not with shame or guilt, but with satisfaction, as though she were unveiling a masterpiece. "They live because I allow it," she whispered, her voice smooth as silk. "Their punishment is not death, but remembrance. They swore vows of eternity, and eternity they shall have." The heir's lips parted in horror, but no words came. Behind the walls, the men moaned again, the sound like a chorus of the damned. He clutched the candle tighter, its flame barely holding against the suffocating dark. One voice rose above the others, pleading, broken, calling for freedom. The boy's chest ached as he recognized the despair. They were not just Celeste's husbands. They were men who had once been proud, wealthy, powerful, now reduced to shadows scratching for survival. Celeste touched the brick with a kind of tenderness, as though caressing a lover's cheek. "They are mine," she murmured, "and they shall remain mine until their voices fade." The young heir's stomach churned. He saw his own fate etched in those walls, waiting, inevitable. The realization struck harder than any blow. She was not searching for love. She was searching for prisoners. The chambers echoed with despair, a sound that gnawed at his bones. And though he longed to run, he knew the crypt's doors were already closing behind him. The crypt smelled of damp stone and despair, yet Celeste stood in its heart as though it were a throne room. Her black silks shimmered in the candlelight, and her eyes held the gleam of conviction. The young heir trembled beside her, the sounds of scratching and muffled cries still rising from the bricked chambers. She spoke with a calm that chilled the marrow. "Do you know what binds men to women?" she asked softly, as though teaching a child. "It is their vow, their promise of forever." Her fingers traced the edge of a stone wall, caressing it like skin. And yet, forever, to a man, is no longer than his desire. He swears eternity, and then strays. He swears devotion, and then forgets. Their words are hollow, and their hearts are faithless. The boy swallowed hard, but she continued, her voice smooth, unbroken. I have known their oaths, every one of them. Charles, who toasted to my beauty, but already kept a mistress in Baton Rouge. The Frenchman, who whispered poetry, while his letters confessed debts and secret lovers across the sea. The judge, who thundered of justice in daylight, then sought cruelty in shadows. Do you see? Her lips curved, not in bitterness, but in triumph. So, I gave them eternity. Not the fleeting eternity of words, but the eternal silence of stone. They will never betray me, never stray, never turn their eyes elsewhere. Their fidelity is sealed, their devotion preserved. The young heir's candle quivered as his hand shook. His voice cracked, but he forced it out. You keep them alive. That's... Her gaze slid to him, cool and steady. Yes, she said simply. For death is too merciful. To die is to escape, to leave behind one's vows. But to live buried in darkness, sustained by breath yet denied the world that is true eternity. That is fidelity no man can betray. From the walls came the faint sound of a moan, long and broken. Celeste tilted her head, listening with the serenity of a woman hearing music. They sing their vows still, she murmured. Every scratch of their nails is a hymn. Every whisper of thirst is a confession. They are mine, body and soul, until silence takes them. The heir's knees weakened. His mind spun with terror, but Celeste stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. Do you understand now? She asked. This is not cruelty, this is justice. Men bind themselves to women with lies, and I strip the lies away. I make their vows true. I preserve their love, their loyalty, their eternity. Her hand brushed his cheek, soft and cold. And you, my sweet boy, she whispered, you will not betray me either. You will love me forever. You will keep your promise. And when the time comes, you will join their choir in the dark. The scratching rose louder, as if the imprisoned men had heard her words and cried out in answer. The boy's heart pounded, the truth of her philosophy sinking deep. Celeste Beaumont did not bury her husbands because she hated them. She buried them because she loved them too much to let them go. And in her twisted creed, eternity was not a promise broken, but a prison sealed. The night air hit his face as he stumbled out of the crypt, gasping like a drowning man breaking the surface. The candle had gone out in his frantic rush, leaving only the moon to guide his shaking steps. His lungs burned, his heart thundered, and still he ran, driven by a terror deeper than any nightmare. Behind him, the heavy stone door sealed with a groan, as if the earth itself were closing its mouth upon a dreadful secret. He did not stop until he reached the road, and even then his legs trembled too fiercely to carry him further. He fell to his knees, the dirt biting into his palms, and he wept not from pain, but from the horror etched into his mind. The faces of the entombed men seemed to press against his memory, their muffled cries echoing in his ears. Alive, buried in darkness, condemned to scratch and whisper until their voices broke. The young heir wanted to scream what he had seen. He wanted to run into the town square, seize the hands of strangers, and beg them to believe him. But even as the thought rose, fear smothered it. Who would listen? Who would dare to accuse Celeste Beaumont, the gracious widow whose dinners charmed senators, whose smile softened even the coldest judge? She was beloved, admired, untouchable. And he was nothing but a foolish boy who had followed her where he should not have gone. Worse still, he feared her vengeance. He had seen the calm in her eyes when she revealed her philosophy. It was not the look of madness, but of certainty. She believed in her creed, and anyone who threatened it would be silenced as thoroughly as the husbands walled in stone. If she ever learned he had spoken a word, He knew his fate would be sealed. So he swallowed his voice. In the days that followed, he went about his life in the city with a mask of composure, but inside he unraveled. At night, when the house was quiet, he heard again the scraping nails, the broken whispers, the moans that rose from the crypt's hidden chambers. He pressed pillows over his ears, but the sound came from within his mind, and there was no shutting it out. He grew pale. His appetite withered. Servants whispered of his decline, wondering what illness clutched him so cruelly. When Celeste passed by him in public, her eyes alight with charm, he flinched. He wondered if she knew if her smile was a mask hiding suspicion, if her laughter carried a promise of retribution. Every glance from her was a blade at his throat. And yet, he could not turn away. Some nights he found himself walking near the Beaumont estate, drawn by a morbid gravity. He would stare at the house, its windows glowing warmly, as though nothing dark could dwell within. But then his gaze would drift to the crypt among the oaks, and his stomach would knot with dread. He told himself to leave, to forget, to flee the city if he must, but his feet lingered. Terror bound him as tightly as chains. His silence became a prison. He could not confide in family, nor in friends. He bore it alone, the knowledge festering like rot in his chest. And in that silence, fear grew teeth. Every knock upon his door made him tremble. Certain Celeste had sent someone to drag him into the dark. Every shadow lengthening across his chamber made his pulse quicken, as though she herself had come to collect her vow. The heir's terror consumed him, not with fire, but with slow erosion. He was no longer the bright, naive boy who once admired the widow's beauty. He was hollowed by dread, haunted by truths too monstrous to name, and trapped in a silence that gnawed at his soul. For he knew that speaking would damn him, and keeping silent was damning him still. The priest had carried his burden in silence for far too long. Rumors drifted through the parish like smoke, clinging to every pew, whispered after every sermon. He had seen the hastily sealed coffins. He had heard the undertaker's trembling confession. He had noticed Celeste's wealth multiplying, her influence spreading like ivy over stone. And always, in the shadow of her grace, lingered the stench of unease. One evening, as the bell tower marked the hour, he resolved to act. Candlelight flickered across the rectory walls as he prepared his words, though no scripture could shield him from the dread that gnawed at his soul. Still, he told himself, evil thrives in silence, and silence had ruled too long. He arrived at the Beaumont estate under a veil of night. The grand house glowed warmly, as though it were any ordinary home, not the lair of whispered horrors. Servants bowed their heads as he passed, their eyes downcast, their mouths sealed. The priest knocked upon the carved oak door, and Celeste herself answered, radiant in silk, her smile as polished as ever. "Father," she greeted softly, as though surprised yet pleased by his presence. "To what do I owe the honor?" His hands trembled, but he steadied them against his robe. "The crypt," he said. "I have questions, and I will have answers." Her eyes glimmered, not with fear, but with amusement. She stepped aside, motioning him inward. The parlor awaited, bathed in golden candlelight, the table set with a decanter of wine, dark and rich. She poured with elegance, her hand steady, her gaze fixed upon him. "Surely a man of God does not come to accuse without proof," she said, offering him the glass. He did not take it. His voice rose, firmer now, emboldened by years of suppressed conviction. "3 husbands vanish into the earth, and each time you emerge untouched, wealthier, untouchable. I have heard of coffins sealed without blessing, of whispers in the walls, of shadows by the crypt. Tell me, Celeste Beaumont, what truth lies beneath your soil?" For a moment, silence reigned. Then she laughed a sound as delicate as silver bells, yet sharper than any blade. "Father," she murmured, "you speak as though you fear me." "I fear only for the souls you may have condemned," he replied, "and for your own." Her smile deepened, though her eyes hardened like glass. She lifted the glass of wine toward him, pressing it into his hand. "Then, drink with me," she said. "If you seek truth, you will find it here." The priest hesitated. He thought of his vows, of his duty, of the parishioners who trusted him. He thought too of the rumors, of the suffering he feared hidden beneath the crypt. The wine trembled in his grasp. At last, he set it down untouched. Celeste only smiled, serene as a saint. "Then may God keep you, Father," she whispered. That was the last anyone saw of him alive. By morning his chambers stood empty, his bed unslept in, his robes folded neatly as though waiting for his return. The parish rang its bells in sorrow, and the town mourned. Celeste herself walked among the mourners, her veil drawn, her eyes glistening with feigned grief. A coffin was lowered into consecrated ground, the earth ceiling shut upon nothing. The faithful wept. The widow prayed. And beneath the silence of the crypt, the truth remained buried. The arrival of the detectives shook Cypress Grove like a sudden storm. 2 men from New Orleans rode in with polished boots and sharp eyes, summoned not by formal charge, but by the tide of whispers that had grown too heavy for the parish to bear. They carried themselves with authority, their presence unsettling the townsfolk who crossed themselves as they passed. Celeste greeted them as though they were honored guests. She opened her grand doors wide, her silks glimmering in the lamplight, her smile practiced, her voice smooth as cream. She led them to her parlor, where a fire crackled and glasses of brandy waited. Laughter spilled easily from her lips, her charm wrapping around them like velvet. The detectives listened politely, sipping the liquor, but their eyes wandered. One studied the portraits on the walls, noting the faces of 3 husbands who had vanished into rumor and earth. Another glanced toward the window, where the family crypt loomed in the moonlight, its iron gate glistening with dew. The key, they noticed, hung from a golden chain around Celeste's neck, rising and falling with the rhythm of her breath. Questions began gently. They asked of her late husbands, of their health, of their fortunes. Celeste answered with grace, her tone balanced between sorrow and resilience. She spoke of Charles, lost to the storm, of Etienne, who fled debts across the sea, of Judge Harland, whose pride had undone him. Each tale polished, each detail rehearsed, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. Yet beneath her beauty, the detectives sensed something coiled. They traded glances, though neither spoke their doubts aloud. One detective, the elder, seemed lulled by her charm. He toasted her strength, praised her hospitality, and accepted a second glass of brandy. But the younger lingered in silence, his gaze drawn always to the crypt. His ear caught the faintest note in her voice when she spoke of eternity, a flicker too practiced to be natural. His mind returned to the whispers he had heard in Town of Songs at midnight, of scratching in coffins, of graves without bodies. That night, after leaving the estate, he did not rest. While his partner slept soundly at the inn, warmed by wine and convinced of Celeste's innocence, the younger man walked the outskirts of the plantation. The air hung heavy with magnolia and decay. He watched the crypt from the cover of trees, and in the stillness of the hour, he swore he saw her figure gliding toward it, a lantern in her hand. He followed, cautious, his steps muffled by the damp earth. He saw her kneel at the iron gate, her lips moving in a whisper, her hand pressing the key to the lock but not turning it. And then, just as he leaned forward to hear, a sound carried on the air. A muffled thud. A dragging scrape. A faint, strangled cry. His breath caught. The widow did not flinch. She only hummed that soft tune the townsfolk had whispered of, a melody that curled like smoke and shivered in his bones. He retreated before she could sense him, heart pounding, mind racing. He knew what he had heard. He knew what he had seen. Yet he also knew the danger of speaking it aloud. For Celeste Beaumont had trapped more than her husbands. She had ensnared the entire town in her web, silencing them with beauty, wealth, and fear. And now, the trap was closing on him. He vowed that before another coffin was lowered into empty ground, he would uncover the truth. But in his heart, he feared he was already too late. The dawn was gray when the younger detective returned to the plantation. His resolve was hard, his fear buried beneath duty. He carried no warrant, no permission, only the weight of the whispers that had followed Celeste for years. The townsfolk would not act. His partner had been lulled by charm. If the truth was to be dragged into daylight, it would be by his hand alone. He crossed the grounds in silence, the dew soaking his boots, the oaks bending heavy with moss. The crypt loomed ahead, dark against the paling sky. The gate was locked, as always, the key resting against Celeste's heart. Yet, he had taken a duplicate, crafted in secret, while her laughter filled the parlor. The iron door groaned as it opened. He stepped into the dark, his lantern spilling yellow light across the stone. The air struck him like a blow, damp, sour, thick with despair. And then came the sound. Scratching, desperate, and unending. A chorus of voices hoarse with thirst, raw with terror, rising together in a cacophony that clawed at his soul. He moved deeper, the flame trembling in his grip. His eyes found the chambers, those narrow brick cells, their cracks spilling fingers, eyes, fragments of broken men. Charles, pale and skeletal, clawed at the wall. Etienne gasped words in French, his voice nearly gone. Judge Harlan's once proud face was hollow, his eyes burning with madness. They were alive, still alive, bound not by earth but by stone, prisoners of their vows. The detective staggered back, his throat tight with horror. He knew he could not unsee this. He knew he could not leave them to this fate. With trembling hands, he raised his lantern and his pistol, shouting their names, promising freedom. The walls shook as the men inside clawed harder, the sound rising, unbearable. And then came her voice. Smooth, unhurried, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. "Detective," Celeste said from the doorway, her black silks trailing across the stone. "Do you think eternity can be broken by one frightened man with a key?" He turned, his pistol raised, but her calmness unsettled him more than any weapon could. Chains were thrown around her wrists by townsfolk summoned in haste, her influence finally cracked by the evidence he had uncovered. Yet she did not weep, nor plead. She only smiled, her eyes shining with terrible serenity. The doors of the chambers were smashed open. Hands clawed into daylight, bodies crawling from darkness into morning. Charles, Etienne, Judge Harlan, the men stumbled forward, broken but alive, their moans echoing like the dead risen. The town gasped, recoiled, cried out. The truth had spilled free, undeniable, damning. And through it all, Celeste stood tall, even in chains. Her voice cut through the cries of the men, through the shouts of the crowd, steady as the toll of a bell. "You cannot kill what is already eternal," she whispered. "They are mine. They shall always be mine. And even as you bury me, I will sing from the earth. My vow does not end." The detective shivered, though the sun now rose across the plantation. The men were freed, the crypt unsealed, the widow bound. Yet in her calm defiance, he heard the truth no chains could silence. For Celeste Beaumont's secret was not merely the husbands she had buried alive. It was the vow that lingered beyond flesh, beyond death, beyond time itself. And as the oaks swayed and the magnolias wept dew, her voice lingered, soft and certain. Eternity, she promised, had only just begun.